Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for making the time to be here. On behalf of Raja and Tan, I'd like to welcome you to our firm. My name is Matthew Koh. I'm a partner here at Raja and Tan in our international arbitration practice. Before we start, I just wanted to make a few administrative remarks. So please send your handphones to silent in the usual way so that we're not interrupted. For those who are joining us online, welcome to you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. We're very sorry that you can't join us here in person or for the wonderful networking that we will have after this event. But for those of us who are here, please stay back after this event to network and catch up with people that you've not seen in some time. We will be having today, just to signpost, we will be having first a short presentation by our esteemed speaker, Gabriel, and then after that, a dialogue between Gabriel and Francis, finally concluding with a bit of questions and answers. So please feel free to post questions from your seat to our esteemed speakers. So now to start off, I would like to welcome Ms. Sapna Janggiani KC, who is the chair of the CIARP Singapore, to make some welcome remarks. Thank you, Sapna, please.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to what is a very special event. And it's special for a number of reasons. Firstly, I believe that I initially wrote to Gabrielle asking her if she would be so kind to speak to us in Singapore in 2019, almost 4 years ago. The event was due to happen in 2020, but we all know what actually happened in 2020, and of course it didn't go ahead. But I'm so pleased that we could resurrect it again. I'm so pleased that she made time for us in her very short trip here this week. It's just wonderful that we finally made it possible to have this event. Secondly, this is the first event in which CIARP Singapore is partnering with the International Law Association Singapore branch and also the NUS Centre for International Law. All of these organisations are important thought leaders in different but very overlapping spaces. So I look forward to much more fruitful collaboration between our organisations as we keep talking about important issues in our fields and we increase our capacity for thought leadership in Singapore. Finally, last but definitely not least, today's subject is both an important and very topical subject. There has been a lot of focus on the mediation of investor-state disputes, particularly in the last couple of years. I think we've seen the IBA investor-state mediation rules, we've seen the ICSID rules, we've got UNSA Trial Working Group 3 looking at reforms to ISDs, and one of the things that they're looking at very closely is mediation. Of course, the Centre for International Law set up a project specifically looking at conciliation and mediation in investor-state disputes in 2016, and they've been monitoring this subject very closely. So we're all talking about the mediation of investor-state disputes a lot, but I'm not sure how much of it is actually happening. And that's one of the topics that we will be grappling with today. So thank you very much indeed, Gabrielle. Thank you also, Francis, who is a good friend of our branch and one of our former chairs. We're really delighted to have you here today. Can I also thank Matthew, without whom tonight would not have been possible. His seamless organisation of today has been excellent. And thank you, of course, to Raja and Tan, our hosts. So over back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Sapna. So before I hand the time over to our speakers, let me first introduce our two esteemed speakers. Actually, they don't need any introduction. I'm sure everyone in this room knows who they are. So first, our speaker, Ms. Gabrielle Kaufman-Kohler. She's a partner at Levy Kaufman Kohler in Geneva. She practices international, commercial, and also investment arbitration. She has been ranked as one of the most influential arbitrators in the world, regularly regarded as one of the most in-demand arbitrators in all fields of law. But not only is she an influential and esteemed arbitrator, she is also a very well-published academic. I'm sure many of us here have benefited from her writings, and she's also the honorary president of ICCA since 2020 and of the Swiss Arbitration Association. So we very much look forward to hearing from her on the topic of today's event. Our moderator, Mr. Francis Xavier SC, is the regional head of disputes at Raja & Tan, also a very recognized arbitrator and regularly ranked as one of the top litigators in Asia. Francis has been involved in all manner of disputes, cross-border disputes in all areas of law. But specifically, I think, to tonight's event, as someone who has been or is actually involved in the mediation of an investor-state dispute, we look forward to Francis sharing with us his insights on this topic. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the time over to Gabriel to give us a presentation. Gabriel, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be back here after 3 years, 3 long years. I was actually here in February 2020. It was a strange period where COVID was starting to happen, but we didn't really know where we were heading. It was really the unknown. And this event was cancelled. So happy to be back here now. A mediation of investor-state disputes, passing fad or paradigm shift. I don't know the answer. And I will simply focus on a few points that may get us closer to the answer. Let me I have 3 findings, 4 concerns or obstacles, and then I get to my conclusion, and then we can continue the discussion, all of us, because it should really be an interactive discussion. The first finding is if you look at the investor-state disputes scene, we see intense activity, and Sapna has mentioned a good part of it. It's intense activity about mediation. It's not mediation activity. So that's quite a difference. Many publications, including in particular the CIL project, was a number of reports and surveys. There's clauses referring to mediation that are inserted into treaties quite regularly in the recent years. One example is the EU-Singapore IPA. There's mediation rules being drawn up. The ICSID has prepared mediation rules last year. The IBA had mediation rules a little earlier. The mediation guides being drafted. The Energy Charter Secretariat has one, for instance. And that same activism in favor of mediation is, of course, found in Working Group 3 of UNCITRAL that works on reform of ISDS. States have been actively participating in making submissions. For instance, Indonesia has made an extensive submission proposing to introduce mandatory mediation in treaties. The UNCITRAL Secretariat has engaged in drafting rules now. There are rules that were published last month. a mediation guide and some other documents that are supposed to be discussed in late March in New York. I have at the end of my slideshow, I have a very selective bibliography of some of these efforts. So I don't have to go further into it and rather can focus on concepts and issues. So that's the first finding, intense activity. But then there's another one, that's the low number of actual mediations. We all know that since the enactment, the adoption of the ICSID Convention in 1965, effective in 66, ICSID has had 13 conciliations. I will use conciliation and mediation as equivalent, although we know that traditionally in public international law, they stand for different things. But here, they often used without distinction. 13 conciliation proceedings at ICSID. We know less about the 30 mediations that were identified by one of the ICSID counsel, Frank Anishke, who spoke about it at Queen Mary last year and has not so far published her findings. But even then, that means 43 compared to about 1,300 arbitrations. It is a low number. And so the question is, why is the number so low? Some say states do not settle, but that is a myth. States do settle, and that's my third finding. Here it is. States do settle. If we look at the UNTAC figures that cover all the known investment arbitrations, we can calculate that there is a settlement rate of 19.6 of the arbitrations that are brought are ended in a settlement. That's relatively high, and the actual number must be much higher, because we also know from a World Bank study that only 6% of all the investment disputes go to arbitration. That means 94% of the investment disputes are either never resolved because the investor abandons his claims, or are resolved in local courts, or are settled. So when we put this together with the other two findings, it's hard to understand why there is this low number of actual mediations. So one possibility may be that states like direct negotiations and dislike assisted negotiations. I'm not sure that is the case. Common sense would dictate that if you can get to a settlement in direct negotiation, a fortiori you would be able to settle with assistance. So that really calls for looking at the obstacles, and many obstacles are being asserted, but I have selected 4 because I think that these are concerns, right? Many of the issues that are raised are not real issues, or they can be easily solved if they are issues. For instance, it is said that there is no sufficient awareness. I think with the current debates, I mean, this is just one example among so many. The awareness by now is achieved, and if it needs to be further increased, other efforts will continue to raise it. No adequate mediation rules. That might have been true a number of years ago, but it's not true anymore. By the way, the ICSID mediation rules are standalone rules. You don't need to link them to an ICSID arbitration. They can be used for any dispute. Difficulties was enforcement of mediated outcomes. That should be resolved with the Singapore Convention of 2018. Where exactly are the difficulties? And now we have to look at some obstacles that may be more serious. There's one which I call the political factor, and that covers a number of different elements that reflect the nature of the state. It's linked to accountability, to governance. It includes a tendency to shift responsibility rather than to take it, assume it, meaning shifting to the tribunal. If the decision is then adverse, state officials can still blame it on the tribunal who didn't understand the issues, but will not be criticized internally for having surrendered in front of a foreign investor and wasted public funds. So that is the scapegoat or type of issue. There are also fears of criticism by not only by the state authorities for those who have made the decision to settle within the state, but also from the public. There may be fears of accusations of corruption. There may be difficulties in obtaining a budget for a settlement, whereas it may be easier to obtain the budget if you have an award and are under an obligation to pay. All these issues are real issues, and they're well mapped out in the CIL survey on the obstacles. Now, even if they're real, it doesn't change the stats that we've seen before, that about 20% of investment arbitrations are settled. So it doesn't prevent the states to settle. So if we try to, if we think the advantages of mediation, and you all know them, so I will not repeat them, I will maybe only emphasize that mediation is not limited to monetary relief. You may well, in a mediation, revive an investment project that has derailed. And so the possibilities are much more open, and the creative element seems important to me for investment in particular. So if we think mediation can benefit to the disputing parties in investment as well, then we should try and see how to resolve this political factor. There are different approaches. One is that you would strengthen or motivate state officials to conduct a mediation if they have some kind of a basis, some authority for it. And for that, you would inserting clauses into treaty would be indeed a good start. Now, the question that arises, should the clause be mandatory in the sense that it would mediation would be a mandatory pre-arbitral condition? There are different views about that, because on the one hand, we all know that mediation is not good for every dispute, but at the same time, if you don't have an obligation to mediate, the reluctance that is due to the political factor may be hard to overcome. Another question is, how would you make this duty to, or this possibility to mediate applicable to all the existing treaties? We know we have about 3,000 treaties, and they will not be changed overnight, and they will not be renegotiated because it would be too burdensome and unrealistic. What one could do here is use the model of the Mauritius Convention on Transparency that allows states to opt into the transparency rules, here the mediation clause, and if the two states involved that is the national state of the investor, and the other state have adopted the convention, then the mediation obligation would apply. These are more technicalities that can be discussed, but inserting a basis into international law may not be sufficient, and it may well be necessary to also have some legal basis in domestic legislation with a clear process of delegation, delegation of authority to conduct a mediation, and then also a clear process about how to agree to the settlement terms. So these are just, there may be other ways of handling this, but these are just two possible avenues. Another obstacle that is not that often raised, but I think is worth thinking about, is the risk of delegalizing investment dispute settlement. We all know that investment arbitration has been created precisely to remove the dispute settlement from the realm of politics and bring it into the domain of the law. Now, if you settle the dispute by way of mediation, you again take it away from the law, and that is a rule of law concern, and it cannot be ignored easily. One possibility might be to include an evaluative element in the, that would be a more legal element in the mediation, but I have not further thought about this, and maybe people with mediation experience will tell me that this is not a good idea. Now I'm a little confused in my notes, but I will find where I am in a moment, and then we're back on track. Another obstacle, which is the third one, knows. Oh yeah. The pictures show us that you can have that people have different reactions when they're faced with an obstacle, right? It's just a parenthesis. The third concern or obstacle that calls for some thinking is the role of the legal industry. It's barely touched in the debate, and it is unclear what role law firms and third-party funders play in respect of mediation. One would think that a lawyer would recommend mediation if it is in his or her client's best interest. But it may be that lawyers who are arbitration lawyers are not sufficiently familiar with mediation, or they have profitability considerations, or they are too engaged in the litigious process and forget to think about opportunities of settlement. All of this should be mapped out, and we should have more data. It's also unclear what the presence of a third-party funder does to the settlement opportunities. And I think we should do some more data collecting on this. There is some in the CIL project, but it comes out with ambivalent results, and of course, it depends whom you ask, right, or these type of questions. So the respondents to a survey will need to be carefully chosen. But that is certainly something where we should have more information. Once we have the information, you'll also know what targeted action could be taken if action is needed at all. The last concern is the tension between confidentiality and transparency. We know that confidentiality is an essential ingredient for productive mediation. It would be difficult to conduct a mediation with the stakes and the progress being reported in the media. So confidentiality is important, but now it stands in contrast with the transparency trend that by now is prevailing in investment arbitration for good reasons, because of the public policy, public interest element that is involved in investment disputes. And we know that the states, civil society, have all criticized investment arbitration for its opaqueness, because speaking of secret tribunals, justice behind closed doors, so we should not go back to that. So how to deal with this tension? The exit mediation rules, for instance, provide that the parties can disclose the existence of a mediation and can disclose the outcome after the conclusion of the mediation. Plus, they can, of course, disclose, because there's a general exception, whatever is required by law. But that, in very sensitive cases, may not be enough. There may be situations where the parties, together with the assistance of the mediator, may have to work out some communication protocol to deal with more difficult disputes. So that's all about concerns, and it's time that I get to my conclusion. Several times these last years, when I had to render an award and either dismiss, and had no option then to either dismiss the claim or award damages, I thought, that's too bad. This project was a good project for the investor. This project was a good project for the state, and actually another solution would serve the disputing parties much better. Of course, I didn't raise it because I felt this is not my role. And had I had a basis, some authority, like the state officials, right, who need authority to mediate, I would have raised it and asked the parties, do you want to think about a settlement? Would you like to have a mediation window when we suspend the arbitration? And at least maybe they would have said no, and then we would have forgotten about it and rendered the award, or maybe one would have said, grasped the opportunity and said yes, and the other would have agreed. So I thought, what can I do to empower arbitrators to have the courage and the legal basis also to raise this kind of issues? In commercial arbitration, I would have no hesitation to raise it, but in investment arbitration, I feel it's somehow improper. So I thought, if I write into the procedure order number 1 a clause that says at any time during the arbitration, the tribunal may raise the possibility of a mediation or a suspension of the arbitration for settlement purposes with the parties, then that clause would be discussed with the parties at the beginning of the arbitration. One may say, I don't want it, and then we would drop it. But it may well remain in the documents if nobody has an objection, and then it would allow the tribunal to be more proactive in this fashion. And so, with this suggestion, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
So we are very, very grateful to Gabrielle, who we've all come to hear, outlining the key difficulties and challenges involved here. I just want to share that we have in the past several years, and I think Gabriel has told you, been involved in two cases which underwent mediation, investor state cases. One of them was more plain vanilla. It involved just one aspect. It was some airport operations, and didn't involve multiplicity of departments. So that got settled through mediation. The other one, I think, ran into the archetypal difficulties that you've highlighted. We have multiple, because it was a huge project involving many different parcels of land in the country involved. And so it ran into the control of a number of key agencies apart from the finance and economic divisions. And so that's a mediation which is still going on. It's gone on for about 2.5 years. The end doesn't seem to be quite in sight, but people are still very keen to move it ahead. It's going through the different stakeholders. Obviously, as Gabriel has mentioned, one of the difficulties is that each agency has a different KPI and outlook. There is also a question, as Gabriel has raised, this question of political will, because the position of the current government was that contract is besmirched with some corrupt elements of the former government. And so this platform was part of the election campaign, and naturally the old government got ousted. And so it is quite difficult for the new government to then mediate and pay a sum, at the side. And so it's taking time, but I think there is a will. And I think the silver lining is that the resources available to a state to come up with a creative solution is simply tremendous. Commercial parties don't have that kind of latitude. You can create a new project and then have a win-win arrangement going forward. So you still make money, maybe not the kind of margins you made before, but maybe a longer time frame. So eventually you will make it, and it's a good compromise. So that's a basis on which it's going ahead. But I think the key question, which I think Gabriel today put a keen finger on the pulse of, is how do we encourage, because there's so little of this going on, how do we encourage greater activity in mediation, especially given the kind of success rates that you spoke about, Gabriel? And so I'm going to do something unconventional, if you don't mind. Loretta is with us, so I'm going to just ask Loretta whether she minds sharing with us what her experience has been, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. Loretta, you want to just take my mic and share your perspective?
My experience has been no experience in mediation in investor-state disputes, and the reasons are very clear. Gabriel has outlined them very well, and I think the main reason is the lack of a political will and a political intention to go ahead with it and to really formalize it into a process. And when I moved to Asia, I thought, if it's not going to happen here, it's never going to happen, because it's the Asian way. You look for a settlement. And in fact, the most often cited good example of a successful conciliation is the Timor-Leste Australia case. But of course, people forget that that was a mandatory conciliation under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the parties had really very little choice in the domain. But what Gabriel was also pointing out is that there is resistance towards mandatory mediation and conciliation. The parties don't want the additional delays that may cause. And I think the other very important aspect is the lack of this understanding and training on the part of the lawyers. There is a resistance on the part of the lawyers because they don't know mediation may be an unknown object, because very few of us have actually practiced it. We may be talking about it at conferences, but we don't have a lot of concrete experience. And so there is a resistance there. So I think the way we're doing all the right things now, and there is institutions are behind it. Many arbitration experts are behind it. Arbitrators are behind it. And I think the skill set is there, although the process is very, very different. And you have to know the sector involved. You have a job that is more that of a psychologist when you talk to the parties in a mediation than what we do in arbitration. But I think when there's a will, there's a way, and we are certainly as close as we've been and certainly my practice, to the idea of making it more concrete. But I think it's the important thing is what Gabriel said also, the practice of international tribunals. Perhaps putting that clause in procedure order number 1 will, encourage people to do it more. And at the end of the day, all it takes is the first successful mediation or well-known mediation. But for that, we also have to make it public, and that's probably not going to happen.
Thank you. Well, I think one of the key problems, as you would have guessed, and I think Gabriel touched on this as well, nobody in the government wants to take responsibility for having paid out such large sums of money in a mediation. And so when there's an award, they could hide behind the fact that the tribunal has ordered it. So one thing that could be done, perhaps, which has been done with great success in arbitration, where there's a conundrum and you're trying to resolve it, is to have one principal issue, right? Because everyone says we are going to win it. Both sides says we're going to win this issue. Have that issue, just that issue, perhaps on liability, adjudicated in some form. Maybe not in a full-blown form, but in a pared-down form, right? Have that adjudicated and have, a tribunal maybe issue a decision to say one way or the other where the chips are likely to fall. And that would then give an impetus to the government to say, we better resolve this, because then there is at least a legal basis on which they're saying we are likely to be held liable or not, But that's something that could be tried, an evaluative or adjudicative element. But I'm going to now, yes, Sapna, thank you.
Just a short point that I think we're going to need people at least thinking of mediation and using it in a creative way, as you have suggested. I think one of the problems we have with mandatory mediation, I've seen this in the commercial sector, I had a client that had all mandatory mediation clauses, but pre-arbitration, and the challenge is that a dispute is often not ripe enough at that stage. And you see this particularly in investor-state arbitration. Often at the first letter, I was just discussing this with my colleagues today, they may not have a lot of evidence. And so if you have mandatory mediation right at the beginning, it may well fail. It can be actually very effective at particular milestones when there's been perhaps a hearing on a preliminary issue and a decision, or there's been document production. And so I think we need creative ways to find windows. I mean, that's one of the great things about this procedural order idea, that you can keep thinking about it and keep revisiting it, and the tribunal can mention it without any embarrassment whatsoever. But I think a mandatory mediation clause may not be the way forward, but creative ideas such as you've said certainly would be.
Sabra, one of the aims of this session is to ask Gabriel difficult questions.
Yeah.
I didn't understand this.
Okay, any questions? Yes, somebody at the...
Sorry. I'll give this to you, Ron.
Doesn't work out. Perhaps more a practical question, a sort of conceptual question.
I know you, my friend, but please introduce yourself for the benefit of me.
Given the sort of sui generis nature of investor-state disputes, where you have two parties of quite different characteristics on either side, it strikes me that the pool of potential mediators that are acceptable to both parties might be quite small. So my question is really, of the 30 or so mediations that we know about, that we know happen, or more generally, who is mediating and who might be the appropriate mediators to use in these investor-state arbitrations?
Gabriel, can I filter that? Now, as I was preparing for this session, I saw a huge amount of material, and I think we discussed this, about the fact that, in investments treaty disputes, the mediator has to be this uber man, he has to, because they have state sovereignty, social, uber woman, yeah, sorry, social, cultural ramifications, and so on. What do you think? I think it's hyperbole mainly, but what is your view? Do you think a normal commercial mediator would not be able to handle it with aplomb?
I think you certainly need the mediation skills. So someone who is only an arbitrator like me would not be able to do it, I think. But if you have the mediation skills and you're doing commercial mediations, I'm not certain you will understand the intricacies of the operations of the state with the different agencies and the like. So maybe you need someone who has the mediation skills plus has an understanding of how a state works and what the potential liability is, of course. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's rocket science, right? Reasonably intelligent people can acquire that. And there are actually now a number of institutions that run training programs for mediation in investor state. So that should not, I think, be a major issue. It has struck me that the ICSID rules provide also for co-mediation, and that is by two people. And I wonder, that might be a reflection of the different characteristics of the two parties. It seems challenging to me because you really need to get along well with, or at least have good procedures to get along well with the co-mediator. But that might make it easier to agree on mediators.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk, Gabriel. Shreyas from Bangalore, and also Maxwell Chambers here last week. Two quick points for you to consider. I agree with Sapna that the putting the mediation and binding it in a cage, in a gilded cage at the beginning of the process is likely to kill it. And as a variation of your idea, would you consider identifying individuals or institutions which are conflict-free and identified and named in PO1 so that you have a parallel mediation track which parties can get into, for example, limiting disclosure, limiting procedural aspects, or in fact, as here Francis has suggested, looking at, and I would suggest more than one, so that some aspects of mediation require a non-evaluative approach, some aspects may require an evaluative approach, but the time that is spent in looking for the conflict-free individual or institution is immense, and that acts as a massive barrier to entry. And the second quick point for you to consider is this talk of double hatting and triple hatting is something I disagree with. I've said so at UNCITRAL many times. I see this as an entry barrier to individuals who want to segue in from one counsel practice to perhaps moving into arbitrator, moving into mediator. And those of us who carry three things on our card, as I do, counsel, arbitrator, and mediator, are convinced that the proper analogy is not hatting, but linguistic ability. So the ability to deploy one type of intelligence, emotional perhaps more in the mediation context, something that is more legalistic in the counsel or the arbitrator context, is not a demerit of the individual concerned. It is in fact an attribute that one might have to look for, especially for mediation. So whether we should start rethinking the notion of double and triple hatting.
So far, we have not considered double hatting for mediators because it will become triple hatting. But it's an interesting point. Yeah, I had not thought about it. Also, the idea of having some kind of available mediator to whom the parties could resort in the course of the arbitration, that may be a help as well. I've asked myself whether you could have a mediation window. Yeah, you do this sometimes in commercial arbitration, which is already built into the schedule, because otherwise, and if then the mediation starts, you can of course extend, but otherwise it's also, you have a calendar running and everybody's on track and you don't want to disrupt this, and you just go and you don't really think about the mediation opportunities. Even if you write it into PO1, it may just be dead letter. Yes, yeah.
Question for Francis, local question, but we take it.
I don't know if that's allowed, but let me hear you.
Okay, my name is Vijay. I'm a qualified mediator in the maritime section. Not as heavy as investor, but it's still nascent in that field, and it's more arbitration or legal. if you had to draft a mediation clause in your arbitration clause as a pre-arb, what institution would you put in Singapore to go to for mediation? I mean, the fragmentation that I see here, I'm not sure, Gabriel, if you have that in Switzerland, although you're the same size of state as we are. But where would you guide me as a company or an investor state to go to?
Speaking personally, if it's a cross-border dispute of an international nature, it will be the SIMC, the Singapore International Mediation Center. So I hope, Vijay, that's fortunately was not.
That's where I'll head up. Okay. That was a free consultation.
Yes, Matthew. Yes, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jonathan Ellis.
Yes.
Quick question. So obviously we're talking about mediation, but there's, in lots of BITs, there's conciliation as well, which can run prior to the actual dispute. My understanding of that is a little bit nascent, so I apologize, but the idea that you can have a sort of process beforehand, get to a non-binding result, and then potentially go into mediation, is that something that you've looked at?
I would equate mediation and conciliation in that respect. And when I said there's a number of treaties, not a high number, about in recent years, about 70% that of treaties concluded have included conciliation mediation clauses. 20 years ago, it was practically inexistent. So I would not make the distinction, but it seems to me that going through a conciliation and then starting arbitration and then mediating is a little bit much. No?
Yeah,
but maybe there are situations where it is appropriate.
They seem to constitute tribunal members rather than mediators in a conciliation, from what I've seen. But
Yeah, so it's more like in commercial arbitration where in certain systems, the arbitrator can function as a type of mediator, conciliator, or at least settlement facilitator. Yeah. That is very cultural. There are places in the world where it's just inconceivable, and other places where you think it's relatively normal.
Most common lawyers will get a tummy upset when they hear of a concept like that.
But it can go to your point where you get the kind of important issues
Right.
and you get a steer on where that's going, which can be helpful.
Right. Yes, Michael.
Michael here from Control Risks. Just following on from that point, where I've been involved in assisting states and they wanted to do a settlement through negotiation, what they've done is an amicable award. So they've done the negotiation, they've come to a conclusion, then they've turned to the tribunal and said, write your award to reflect what we've agreed, please. And so I think that's one way that it may be getting away from the fear that the politicians and the civil servants had of people coming back on them in the future because they've got the award behind them.
But the award, just to understand, the award was a consent award. So it said the parties have agreed to pay so and so. It did not say the arbitrators have ordered.
Agreed.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the public doesn't read the award.
Well, a big assumption there, Mr. Pierre.
Yes, yeah. That will certainly help for enforcement. And that's one of the possibilities in the ICSID mediation rules, that if you do it in parallel with an arbitration, then you have a consent award, and then you benefit from the ICSID privileged enforcement regime.
Yeah, enforcement as well as protection of anyone coming back and saying you took a cut on the side.
Of course.
Francis, I understand there's a question that's been posted on the Zoom online. So Jonathan will put it up and then you can take a look at it. Sorry.
Stephanie Hunt, former MIPS. Where's the question? Yeah, this is a comment.
Yeah, this is what was typed.
Right.
Yeah, there's a whole discussion about delays and additional costs due to mediation. That of course cuts both ways, because if the mediation succeeds, then you save costs and time. And if it does not succeed, then you have added some cost and time. But the mediators will tell you that the success rates are above 50%, and then I would say it's worth trying.
Right. Yes.
Rob Wilson, CMS. Thank you for your presentation, Gabrielle. I suppose going back to the question on the screen, passing fad or paradigm shift, assuming that it's not a passing fad and this is a shift, then I suppose my question is, well, how do you persuade this shift to, how do you make this shift happen more quickly and more effectively than arguably it's happening at the moment? And I suppose in that regard, the focus should be on the states in particular, because those investors involved as commercial entities will be certainly more familiar and certainly happier to go down the mediation route than perhaps the states are.
Yes, I hear someone who speaks was CEOs of multinationals telling me they have the same accountability issues because they have a board to whom they have to say, well, actually, we made a mistake with this project and now we have to pay. So it's the same feel of capitulation surrender. And then they have, the board has shareholders. And so these issues are not absent, I think, in commercial entities, but they're not as strong as what I think Loretta said, that we need to talk about it, raise awareness more familiarity, so that people are not reluctant to engage with mediation or recommend to clients to mediate, don't really know much more, and plus getting some basis in the treaty and domestic legislation for state officials to have the confidence that they are protected if they conduct mediations.
Amanda Lees from Kingwood Millicents. Thanks, Gabrielle. I was just going to say, one of the other barriers, I think, is the fact that often you have claimants give very inflated claims at the beginning of a matter. And I think that that is often a barrier for the state in terms of being able to settle the claim. Because if the number is so big, it makes it really difficult to settle the claim. Whereas if the number was more realistic, it may make it easier to then actually approach it. Thinking of a matter where I was involved, where the original number was 580 million. Then when they actually got a quantum expert on board, it dropped to 100 million. And then of course, the actual investment was only 8 million. And I can say this because the award is public and I was acting for the state who won. So, you know, and obviously the tribunal said, they said the state won, but they also said if they were going to have awarded any damages, it wouldn't have been any excess of the actual investment and some interest. So I think that this is often a barrier. Like if you get a claim for 580 million, it's very, very hard for a state to settle that. So one thing I was curious about from when you said there were 20% had settled, is it clear from those statistics when they settle? Have people looked into when they've settled? Is it at the kind of this early stage where you trigger the cooling off period, or is it after the actual notice is filed? Or
no, the 20% are after the arbitration request. So the cooling off period is passed.
the notice of dispute is passed to, it's an actual arbitration that is settled. But there are, of course, others that are settled before. I think one of the difficulties, and it's good that you raised this, is the litigation risk analysis that is being carried out at the beginning before the claim is brought. That is often unrealistic. So maybe a good way of handling this would be to give it to an independent expert and who would look at the figures and say, this is not 580, it's 20, or something like that.
Yeah.
Can I just say something quickly, because you made me think about it. You were talking about the reluctance of states to settle, but to me, mediation is not settlement. It's a form of mediated dispute resolution. It's a different type of process from settlement. There is a facilitator sitting there who contributes to the dialogue that is ongoing between the parties and brings in, and this is the point you were making about, which is a very important one I never thought of, the delegalization. And it's in the hands of the mediator, or the individual who's actually very instrumental in making the process successful. So if you sell it that way, in a sense, to the states, and that's again a question of training, of how you present the issue.
That's not my experience of mediation.
But well, maybe because these people were the wrong ones.
Yeah, well, maybe.
I don't know. Because maybe for settlement of, mediation of investor-state disputes is very different from.
That's a different model
commercial.
of mediation. So
Amanda, do you need a mic?
Well, I think that's a very interesting point, Loretta, because there's two different models of mediation. I'm not a trained mediator, but I've done lots of mediations in commercial disputes as counsel. And there's your facilitative mediator, which is what most mediators are trained to do and what most mediators do. And there's your evaluative style of mediation. Now that's become a lot less trendy and not so common. It is often, in my experience from Australia, where they do a lot of mediation, and probably partly what might have contributed, obviously, the Timor-Leste Australia conciliation, probably the fact that Australia comes from a culture of doing mediation and resolving disputes by mediation. What you find in Australia is people will get someone with sufficient authority, like a former judge. So although they don't have an official role as an evaluator, and they are still, and do themselves make it clear that they're there just to facilitate the settlement by the parties, they will, in the private caucuses, have the authority to twist arms and say, be realistic, you're not going to get this much for this and this reason. And, because of the fact that they're a former judge and got that sort of gravitas and, experience, they're able to do that. And so I think there is a point about the availability of the right people to be the mediators, because they need the skills, plus they need to be able to persuade people. Actually, when you get in front of the tribunal, you're not going to get that much for these reasons. And similar to the state, where you've got exposure for these reasons. So, yeah.
But that, just following up on this, maybe investor-state mediation should more be about evaluative mediation than facilitative. I thought about this because of this delegalization risk, but it's not only for that reason. Maybe it is more realistic that the state then gets some comfort that this is not only interest-based, but it's also law-based.
Maybe that's why what we saw first at ICSID and investor-state disputes generally was conciliation, which for anyone who's confused is where there is a non-binding decision given by the conciliator. And conciliation or some robust reality testing with some evaluative mediation may be something that could start shifting the paradigm a bit more, because it addresses head-on this problem of accountability. And just as an FYI, CIR Singapore will be having a session on evaluative versus facilitative mediation at Singapore Convention Week. You can all mark your diaries.
With that commercial break, is that any other? Yes, over there. Matthew, over there.
Hi, good evening. My name is Judy Lau. I'm from the Singapore International Mediation Center. Thank you very much for your suggestions about, the sort of an ARPNet, ARP style process to empower arbitrators to order. I'm sorry, it's sort of fading out, but to order mediation. I think that would be a very helpful tool, actually, to help resolve disputes. You mentioned co-mediation as well. This is something that we have done as well as at IMC with Japan, where we had a Singapore-appointed mediator and a Japanese-appointed mediator. So we really welcome more, innovative solutions like that. But I'd also like to pick up on Francis' suggestion about adjudicating one principal issue. And I think it's very much in line with what quite a few members of the Singapore judiciary have been saying as well about appropriate dispute resolution. ADR now stands for appropriate dispute resolution. So you carve out the issues within a dispute, and then you arbitrate what you need to arbitrate, but you also mediate what you need to mediate. So if you can stagger it and sequence it properly, like what Sapna said about timing, and timing is crucial. Sometimes things are not right, and of course we totally understand that, but it probably needs sort of a bit of a relook. And if CIARB and other organizations can take up this idea of appropriate dispute resolution and carving out the issues, then I think we're in for a good.
Yeah, exactly. I think we had one matter with the SIMC, you're probably aware, where there was an Israeli investment into hospitality, a huge hospitality project in Vietnam. And then I think the whole issue turned on the valuation at a certain point. So we just had that adjudicated, and then the entire panoply of issues fell away. So we take a point, and I think that's a point that Gabriel said, and especially for investor state, the state agencies would like to have that comfort, that this key pin is going to fall in a certain way, and we then, as Loretta says, not settle the matter just by paying out money, but then come to an appropriate resolution of the dispute based on where that pin falls, We haven't really asked, yes, back with the mic, Matthew.
One challenge we've found really is in the perception by some governments that if a matter is mediated, there could be the possibility of some hanky-panky thing going on between the parties themselves. And therefore, I think that is a challenge really that we need to combat. But I don't know if you've had any ideas or suggestions or how you would advise such.
And that's why the event, as Gabriel said, and I think Loretta echoed, the evaluative aspect then gives credence to the entire substratum of the process, rather than it's just we sit down and try and settle it, without any platform, legal platform to rely on, apart from maybe legal advice from your counsel.
So we look forward to the session during Convention Week, end of August to the 1st of September.
Right, back to the second commercial break. Any last difficult questions for, so far I think Gabriel hasn't broken a sweat. Yes, Rob.
So Gabriel, this procedure order number 1, so is this something you're now using in every arbitration?
No, I've not done it yet.
You've not done it yet?
It's in thinking about this session that I thought, I used to do it a long time ago in commercial arbitration, because it's like in China, like in Brazil, in Switzerland and Germany, arbitrators do get involved into settlement facilitation.
Yeah.
And I stopped doing it because in international context, you often have one party that doesn't understand this and thinks that you're mixing the roles and you should not do this as an arbitrator. So I stopped doing it in commercial arbitration, and I would never have thought to do it in investment, but then why not? It is not getting involved in settlement facilitation for the tribunal itself. It is recommending or telling the parties maybe it would be in your best interest to try and resolve this, find a solution to be able to continue this project rather than just paying money or not paying anything, but nevertheless the project is gone.
No, I agree. I agree entirely. And I don't think mediation needs to be, I think it can be flagged up without being made mandatory. Exactly. And many contracts will have it within the escalation clause as an option available to the parties. So they don't need to go to mediation before they go to arbitration, but they might choose to do so. Likewise, if you have this in a procedure order, then basically at some stage, at least it's being flagged up by you as the arbitrator and by the tribunal that they could choose at some point during the proceedings to go off to mediation, not involving you necessarily or anyone from the tribunal, because obviously there would be potential conflict there, but then just going off, and then there would be a natural window at some stage, whether it's just as they're preparing their witness statements or gathering documents or whatever. Mediation doesn't need to take very long, but as was said earlier, it has to happen at the right stage, and both parties, in my experience, need to be fully aware and understand the other side's position if it stands any chance of succeeding.
Yes, I think mediations in investor state, those that have taken place, and you confirmed this was your example, have in the average taken 2 years. So it's rather long compared to a commercial mediation. But that may be because of the state's involvement, because all the different agencies and the like. This microphone has no, it's fine.
Yes, and also the disruptive effect of the pandemic, I think. This has been taking place in the last 2.5 years.
Okay, so that's different.
Right.
No.
Yes.
Perhaps I could say something before the bell goes.
Yes.
Sharma, formerly district judge, formerly Raja and Tan
Formerly
partner,
Raja and
now
Tan, yes.
elsewhere in Edson Law. Gabriel, I'm just curious, if we return to the team, passing Fed or paradigm shift, and you'd be so good as to gaze into your crystal ball, would you be able to tell us perhaps 5-10 years, perhaps 2030 would be a good mark, 7 years from now? Are we more likely to see the passing Fed gaining more percentage and the paradigm shift, or where would we be then? Thank you.
I really don't know. It's a very difficult question, and usually I'm rather assertive and say this is the way to go. You have to go for transparency. You have to do, but then things are more complex, and here it's. In the end, it's political will that will bring about the change. It's the states who control this, and we can kind of try to orientate things, but not much more than that. So I would hope that it's a shift, but it might be a fad.
Thank you. One last question. The gentleman who's been patiently raising his hand several times. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Colin. I'm from Singapore, formerly from the courts. My question to Gabriel is, do you think there should be any special considerations to be had in the development or the enhancement of the principle of confidentiality or privilege in the context of mediation of investor-state disputes, considering the characteristics of the parties, which are asymmetric?
I think, yeah, the confidentiality point is a difficult one, right? The transparency point is a difficult one as well, because there's a double discourse among states about transparency. Yes, of course, we are for transparency, but in this arbitration, we don't want it, right? So, and I often hear this. So this is a little difficult, but the mediation will have this hurdle and will be criticized for this. It's obvious, but then maybe if you have, I remember when I was chairing the Court of Arbitration for Sports at the Olympics, and we did not know how to handle the press. And so we would issue on very sensitive matters, press releases by the court. At 1 o'clock, we would say, the case has been filed, and we will give you further notice at 6 o'clock tonight. And we said the hearing has taken place. The decision will be rendered at 12 tonight. And that's somehow, maybe something like this, of course, it's not the same time frame, but maybe something like that would have to be put in place so that both concerns, transparency, and or both objectives, transparency and confidentiality, can be somehow reconciled?
Thank you, Gabriel. I think we're very grateful. We've had a very insightful, incisive session. We must thank Gabrielle for braving a bigger challenge of flying God knows how many hours, 13-hour time difference as I understand it, and despite that she looks like she is not suffering from an iota of jet lag. But we are very grateful, Gabrielle, for you to come and share your thoughts with us. It's a very timely debate. This is something that I think certainly the legal community in Singapore and around this region are very alive to. So it's been very timely, and I think our minds are alert as to the different nodes that further thought needs to go in and how we can facilitate it. Thank you very much. And of course, people in the audience who've contributed as well with your questions as well as your comments and nice dialogue today. Now, I obviously, do I hand it over back to you, Matthew? Yes, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Gabriel. So before we close this evening, just to say a word of thanks to our co-organizers. So obviously the CIARP Singapore, then also the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore, and last but not least, the International Law Association, the Singapore branch. Thank you very much to everyone who has made the time to attend today, whether physically here or online. I hope that some of you can stay back and join us for some drinks and refreshments, and we hope that this conversation can continue for a long time to come. Thank you very much.